The frigid wind howled across the desolate Montana landscape as Victoria Garland clutched her swollen belly, her knuckles whitening as she rapped desperately on the midwife's door. The year was 1883, and the town of Hecla was caught in one of the worst winter storms in decades. Victoria's child was coming weeks early, and she had nowhere else to turn. "Please," she cried, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Mrs. Thornton, I need help." Victoria, 22 years old and widowed just 3 months prior, had walked nearly a mile through knee-deep snow from her small cabin on the edge of town. Her husband Samuel had died in a mining accident, leaving her alone to face the birth of their first child. The contractions had started just after sunset, and now, past midnight, they were coming with frightening regularity. The door cracked open, revealing Alina Thornton's stern face. The town's only midwife assessed Victoria with cold eyes. "You're that miner's widow, aren't you?" "The one who hasn't paid her bills in town," Victoria nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please, Mrs. Thornton, the baby's coming. I'll find a way to pay you, I swear." The older woman's face hardened. "I've heard that before from your kind. Your husband owed half the town money when that mine collapsed. I won't add to the list of folks he cheated. But I go to the church. Maybe Pastor Williams will take pity on you." With that, Mrs. Thornton closed the door, the lock clicking with finality. Victoria staggered backward, a contraction stealing her breath. The church was on the other side of town, and she knew she wouldn't make it. She clutched the porch railing as her knees buckled. "Madam, you all right there?" the deep voice came from the street. Through tear-blurred eyes, Victoria saw a tall figure leading a horse through the snow toward her. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." The man reached her in 3 long strides. In the dim light from the midwife's window, Victoria could make out a weather-beaten face beneath a snow-dusted hat, concerned eyes scanning her condition. "I'm Jake Calloway," he said, quickly assessing the situation. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Jake had just arrived in Hecla that evening, planning to rest for a night before continuing north to his brother's ranch. At 30 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life working cattle drives and breaking horses across the Montana territory. "My cabin," Victoria managed between breaths. "Edge of town, by the creek." Without hesitation, Jake swept her into his arms. "Which direction?" she pointed shakily, and he carried her to his horse. "I can't ride," she protested. "You won't be riding alone." With surprising gentleness, he helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm securing her against his chest. "Just hold on, madam." Victoria directed him between contractions, each one more intense than the last. The horse moved carefully through the deep snow, Jake keeping their pace steady despite the urgency. "I don't know you," Victoria said, her voice thin with pain. "Just passing through," Jake replied. "Heading to my brother's place near Helena. I'm Victoria Garland." "Well, Mrs. Garland, I reckon your little one's in quite a hurry to meet you." Victoria would have laughed if another contraction hadn't seized her. Instead, she gripped his arm until the pain subsided. They reached her small cabin just as her water broke. Jake helped her down from the horse, then practically carried her inside. The cabin was cold and dark, the fire long extinguished. "Bed's in the corner," Victoria gasped, doubling over. Jake guided her there, then moved with surprising efficiency, locating matches and lighting the oil lamp. He quickly built a fire in the small stove, the kindling catching immediately. "When's the baby due?" he asked, removing his coat and rolling up his sleeves. 3 weeks from now," Victoria said, her face contorted in pain. "But it's coming now. Oh God, it's coming now." Jake had never delivered a baby, but he'd helped birth countless calves and foals on ranches across the West. He'd also seen an army doctor deliver a child during the war, back when he was just a boy serving as a messenger. "I ain't no doctor, Mrs. Garland, but I'll help you through this." Victoria had no choice but to trust this stranger. She nodded, then cried out as another contraction ripped through her. Jake found clean linens in a chest, put water on to boil, and washed his hands thoroughly. He spoke in a calm, steady voice that somehow cut through Victoria's panic. "My sister had 4 children," he explained. "I wasn't present for the births, but I know what needs doing. You're going to be just fine, Mrs. Garland, you and your baby both." Victoria's labor progressed rapidly. Jake positioned himself at the foot of the bed, maintaining a respectful demeanor despite the intimate circumstances. "I can see the head," he announced after what seemed like hours but was likely only one. "Next contraction, you push with everything you've got." Victoria bore down, her hands gripping the bed frame until her knuckles turned white. She had never known such pain nor such determination. Samuel should have been here, holding her hand, not this kind stranger. "Again," Jake encouraged. "You're doing wonderfully." With a final, tremendous effort, Victoria pushed, and moments later the sound of a baby's cry filled the small cabin. Jake caught the tiny infant in his large, calloused hands. "You have a son, Mrs. Garland," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A fine, strong boy." Victoria collapsed against the pillows, exhausted and overwhelmed. Jake cleaned the baby with warm water, then wrapped him in a clean blanket before placing him in his mother's arms. The sight of this new life, with Samuel's dark hair and her own blue eyes, brought fresh tears to Victoria's eyes. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I've been waiting to meet you." Jake busied himself cleaning up, giving mother and child some privacy for their first moments together. When he returned to check on them, Victoria was looking at him with undisguised gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Victoria said firmly. "Mrs. Thornton turned me away. You didn't even know me, yet you helped. That's rare in this world." Outside, the storm continued to rage, snow piling against the windows and wind finding every crack in the cabin's walls. Jake stoked the fire, then moved toward the door. "I should check on my horse, make sure he's sheltered." "There's a lean-to out back," Victoria said. "It's not much, but it'll keep him out of the worst of it." Jake nodded and stepped outside. The blast of cold air was shocking after the warmth of the cabin. He led his horse around back, finding the small shelter Victoria had mentioned. After ensuring the animal was as comfortable as possible, he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots. Victoria had managed to change into a clean nightgown and was sitting up in bed, cradling her newborn son. Jake noticed how pale she looked, the dark circles under her eyes stark against her fair skin. "You should rest," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "I'm afraid to sleep," she admitted. "What if something happens?" Jake pulled a chair close to the bed. "I'll keep watch." "Nothing's going to happen to either of you on my watch." Victoria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I never asked what brought you to Hecla in this weather." "Just passing through," Jake replied. "My brother has a ranch near Helena." "I've been working cattle drives in Wyoming, but he wrote asking for help. His foreman quit and he's short-handed." "You're a long way from Wyoming," Jake smiled faintly. "I don't tend to stay in one place too long, been that way since the war." "You fought?" "Not really. I was too young, only 15 when it ended. I ran messages for an officer from Montana Territory, saw things no boy should see though." Victoria shifted the baby in her arms. "My husband Samuel fought. He came west afterward like so many did. We met when he arrived in Hecla 4 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Garland." Victoria looked down at her son. "Thank you, we weren't wealthy, but we were happy. Samuel was working in the silver mine when there was a collapse 3 months ago. 10 men died." Jake remained silent, recognizing her need to talk. "The mining company gave me enough money to last through winter if I'm careful," Victoria continued. "But the town's been difficult. They say Samuel owed debts I knew nothing about." "Is that why the midwife turned you away?" Victoria nodded. "Mrs. Thornton's husband owns the general store." "Apparently Samuel had an outstanding bill there." Jake's jaw tightened. "That's no reason to refuse help to a woman in labor. People look after themselves here," Victoria said simply. "I've learned that the hard way." The baby made a small sound, and Victoria adjusted her hold, looking down at her son with such tenderness that Jake had to look away. It had been a long time since he'd witnessed such genuine love. "What will you name him?" he asked. Victoria smiled. "Samuel Patrick, after his father. Though I suppose I'll call him Patrick to avoid confusion in my own heart." Jake nodded. "A good name." As the night deepened, Victoria finally succumbed to exhaustion. Jake took the sleeping infant from her arms, cradling him awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. He sat by the fire, watching the tiny chest rise and fall, marveling at the perfect fingers and the small, determined face. "You picked quite a night to arrive, little Patrick," he whispered. "But you've got a brave mother, so I reckon you'll be just fine." Jake had never thought much about having children of his own. His life on the move didn't lend itself to family, and he'd seen too many women left to fend for themselves when husbands died or abandoned them. Yet holding this newborn stirred something in him, a longing he didn't recognize. Outside, the storm began to abate, the howling wind dying down to an occasional moan. Jake placed the baby in the makeshift cradle Victoria had prepared, then checked on mother and child once more before settling into the chair by the fire. Despite his intention to stay awake, the exhaustion of the night soon pulled him into sleep. Dawn broke clear and cold, sunlight reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow. Jake woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. The events of the night came rushing back when he heard the baby's soft fussing. Victoria was already awake, sitting up in bed and reaching for her son. "Good morning," she said softly, noticing Jake stirring. "You kept your promise to watch over us." Jake stretched, working the stiffness from his shoulders. "Didn't do a very good job if I fell asleep." "You delivered my baby in the middle of a blizzard, Mr. Calloway. I'd say you've more than fulfilled any obligation." Jake rose and added wood to the fire. "Are you hungry? I could fix something." Victoria nodded gratefully. "There's not much, some oats and dried apples in the pantry." "I haven't been able to get to town for supplies this past week with the weather." Jake found the provisions and set about making a simple breakfast. As he worked, he considered his situation. He should continue to his brother's ranch where he was expected. But leaving Victoria and her newborn son alone, with no one to check on them and limited supplies, didn't sit right with him. "I'm thinking I might stay another day or two," he said, bringing her a bowl of hot porridge. "Make sure you and the little one are settled before I move on." Victoria looked surprised. "You don't have to do that. You've already done so much." "My brother's not expecting me on any particular day," Jake said, shrugging. "And that snow's deep. Another day to let it settle wouldn't hurt." In truth, Jake was concerned about Victoria's pallor and the remoteness of her cabin. If she developed a fever or the baby took ill, there would be no one to help. "Besides," he added with a small smile, "I promised Patrick I'd teach him to rope a calf, and I'm a man of my word." Victoria laughed, the sound brightening the small cabin. He might need to learn to open his eyes fully first. Jake ended up staying for 3 days. He chopped enough wood to last weeks, made repairs to the cabin that Samuel had left undone, and ventured into town for supplies once the path was clear enough. Victoria protested that she couldn't repay him, but Jake waved away her concerns. "Consider it payment for your hospitality," he said. "It's not often I get to stay in such pleasant company." On his trip to town, Jake learned more about Victoria's situation from the talkative shopkeeper at the general store. Samuel Garland had been well-liked but imprudent with money. The mine collapse had left several widows in Hecla, and the town's charity had its limits. Victoria's status as a newcomer she'd come from St. Louis to marry Samuel didn't help her case. Jake also paid a visit to Mrs. Thornton, the midwife. He didn't raise his voice or make threats, but when he left her house, the woman's face was ashen, and she promised to check on Victoria and the baby the following day. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake prepared to leave. Victoria stood in the doorway, Patrick bundled against her chest, watching as Jake saddled his horse. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice catching. "You saved our lives." Jake adjusted his saddle, avoiding her eyes. "You're a strong woman, Mrs. Garland. You'd have managed." "Please, after everything, call me Victoria." He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "Victoria." Something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the unusual bond formed over these days. Jake cleared his throat. "If you need anything, my brother's ranch is the Circle C, about 40 miles north. Anyone can direct you." Victoria nodded. "Safe travels, Jake, and thank you again for everything." Jake mounted his horse, tipping his hat to her. "Take care of yourself and that boy. He's going to be something special, I can tell." With that, he rode away, forcing himself not to look back until he crested the hill overlooking the creek. From there, he could see the small cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, Victoria still standing in the doorway. He raised his hand in a final farewell, then turned his horse toward Helena. Jake reached his brother's ranch 2 days later, his thoughts still frequently returning to Victoria and Patrick. James Calloway was 3 years older than Jake, with the same tall build but a more settled air about him. He'd established his ranch 10 years earlier and had a wife, Margaret, and 2 young daughters. "Starting to think you weren't coming," James said, greeting Jake with a firm handshake. "That storm hit hard." "Got delayed in Hecla," Jake replied, "had some business come up." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He showed Jake around the property, explaining the issues they faced: shortage of hands, cattle rustling along the northern boundary, and the coming spring drive that would require twice the men they currently had. "I need someone I can trust to help run things," James said plainly. "Someone who knows cattle and can handle men, someone family." Jake understood what his brother was offering: a permanent position, a chance to put down roots. A year ago, he would have declined outright. Now he found himself considering it. "Let me help you through the spring drive," he said finally. "Then we'll talk." Jake threw himself into the work, rising before dawn each day to help with the endless tasks of a working ranch. He hired new hands, trained the younger ones, and rode the boundaries, familiarizing himself with every creek and draw of his brother's land. At night, he joined James's family for meals, finding unexpected pleasure in the domestic routine, but his thoughts often strayed to Hecla. He wondered how Victoria was managing, whether she had enough food, if the baby was thriving. Twice he drafted letters to her, but both times he crumpled the paper, uncertain what to say or if his interest would be welcome. 6 weeks after arriving at the Circle C, Jake received a letter forwarded from Hecla's general store. His hands were unsteady as he recognized Victoria's neat handwriting. "Dear Mr. Calloway," it began formally, "I hope this finds you well. Patrick and I are managing, though the spring thaw has turned the path to town into a quagmire that makes travel difficult. Mrs. Thornton has visited twice since your departure, suddenly solicitous of our welfare. I suspect you had something to do with her change of heart. Patrick grows stronger each day and has your same thoughtful gaze when he's considering something new. I often tell him the story of the kind cowboy who delivered him on that stormy night, though I fear as he grows older, he may think it merely a tale I've invented. The real purpose of my letter is to thank you again and to inform you that I'll be leaving Hecla soon. My parents in St. Louis have offered to take us in, and while I'm reluctant to return east, I see little future for us here. I've tried to find work, but with an infant, my options are limited. I wanted you to know where we'd gone in case you ever pass through Hecla again. Your kindness that night will never be forgotten. Sincerely, Victoria Garland." Jake read the letter 3 times, a heaviness settling in his chest. The thought of Victoria leaving Montana, taking Patrick back east to a city Jake had never seen, left him unexpectedly bereft. At dinner that night, he was quiet, preoccupied. Margaret, James's wife, studied him with knowing eyes. "Something troubling you, Jake?" she asked as they sat on the porch after the girls were in bed. Jake hesitated, then passed her Victoria's letter. Margaret read it carefully, her expression softening. "Sounds like someone made quite an impression on you," she said, returning the letter. "I delivered her baby," Jake said, as if that explained everything. "In a blizzard, the midwife turned her away. And now you can't stop thinking about her." Jake looked out across the darkened pasture. "She's a widow with a newborn. The last thing she needs is some drifting cowboy complicating her life." "Is that what you are? Just a drifting cowboy?" Margaret's voice was gentle but insistent. "Because James says you've been talking about building that line cabin on the north property into something more substantial." Jake had indeed been discussing such plans, envisioning a place of his own while still working with his brother. The idea had taken root in his mind over the past weeks. "I've been considering it," he admitted. "Seems to me a man thinking of building a home might not be drifting anymore," Margaret observed. "And a widow with a baby might appreciate knowing she has options besides returning to her parents." Jake looked at his sister-in-law sharply. "You think I should write to her?" Margaret stood, patting his shoulder as she passed. I think you already know what you want to do, Jake Calloway. You just need permission to do it. The next morning, Jake approached his brother as they worked in the stables. I need to go to Hecla for a few days, he said without preamble. James looked up from the saddle he was mending. Something wrong? No, there's someone I need to see before she leaves Montana. Understanding dawned on James's face. Would this have anything to do with that business that delayed you on your way here? Jake nodded, not elaborating. James studied his brother for a moment, then returned to his work. Take the bay gelding. He's fresher than your mount. Thanks, James. Jake, his brother called as Jake turned to leave. If you're bringing back company, we've plenty of room here until you get that cabin fixed up. Jake rode hard, covering in a day and a half what had taken him nearly 3 days on his initial journey. When he reached the outskirts of Hecla, he reined in, suddenly uncertain. What if Victoria didn't welcome his appearance? What if she preferred the security of returning to her parents? He was offering her an unformed future with a man she barely knew, in a territory known for its harsh conditions and limited comforts. But the memory of her standing in the doorway, Patrick cradled against her, propelled him forward. He had to try. Victoria's cabin appeared deserted when he approached. The lean-to was empty and no smoke rose from the chimney despite the cool spring air. Jake's heart sank. Had she already left, he dismounted and knocked on the door, receiving no answer. Looking around, he noticed the woodpile was diminished but not gone, and the small garden showed signs of recent tending. Perhaps she was in town. Jake remounted and rode toward Hecla, rehearsing what he would say if he found her. The town was quiet in the late afternoon, just a few people moving along the muddy main street. Jake tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. The shopkeeper, Mr. Thornton, recognized him immediately. Back again, are you? Looking for the widow Garland, I'd wager. Jake nodded, not bothering to hide his purpose. Is she still in town? For now, Thornton replied. She's over at the church, helping with some sewing circle, planning to leave on Monday's stage from what I hear. Thank you. Jake turned to go. She's had a hard time of it, Thornton added, his voice softer. Some folks haven't been kind, blaming her for Samuel's debts, Myelina included, I'm afraid. Jake paused. A woman with a newborn deserves better from her neighbors. Yes, well, Thornton looked uncomfortable. Sometimes it takes an outsider to remind us of our Christian duty. Jake found the church easily, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple. He hesitated before entering, removing his hat and brushing dust from his clothes as best he could. Inside, he heard women's voices and the sound of a baby fussing. Victoria sat among 5 other women, all bent over sewing work. Patrick lay in a basket beside her, squirming and making his displeasure known. Jake stood in the doorway, suddenly paralyzed. Then Victoria looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized him. Jake, she said, rising so quickly she dropped her sewing. What are you doing here? The other women turned to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Jake squared his shoulders. I received your letter, he said. Could we speak privately? Victoria glanced at the other women, then at Patrick, who was working himself into a proper cry. Of course, I was just finishing anyway. She gathered her things and picked up Patrick, who immediately quieted against her shoulder. Jake followed her outside, acutely aware of the whispers that erupted behind them. I didn't expect to see you again, Victoria said when they reached the church steps. Her tone wasn't unwelcoming, just surprised. I didn't expect to come back, Jake admitted. But then I got your letter. Victoria looked down at Patrick, adjusting his blanket. I thought you should know we were leaving. That's why I'm here. Jake took a deep breath. I don't think you should go. Victoria looked up, her expression guarded. My parents have offered us a home, Jake. I have no way to support myself here. What if you had another option? Jake removed his hat, turning it in his hands. I'm staying on at my brother's ranch. I'm fixing up a cabin there, something that could be a proper home. It needs work, but the land is good and there's plenty of room for a garden. Victoria's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. Jake, we barely know each other. I know, he said quickly. I'm not asking for any promises, just a chance. Come to the Circle C, see the place. If you don't like it, or if you decide I'm not the kind of man you want in your life, my brother will arrange for you to continue to St. Louis. No obligations. Victoria studied him for a long moment. Why are you doing this? Jake struggled to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. That night during the storm, when I held Patrick just after he was born, something changed for me. I've been roaming since I was 15 years old, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments, but now I find myself wanting to build something lasting. He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. I can't offer you wealth or an easy life, but I can promise to work hard to treat you and Patrick with respect and to try every day to be worthy of your trust. Victoria's eyes shone with unshed tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, Jake urged. That's all I'm asking for now. Patrick chose that moment to let out a lusty cry, bringing a small smile to Victoria's face. He has impeccable timing, she said, bouncing him gently. We should get him home, it's nearly his feeding time. They walked back to Victoria's cabin, Jake leading his horse, the conversation turning to more practical matters. He told her about the Circle C, about James and Margaret and their daughters, about the cabin he planned to expand. At the cabin, Jake built a fire while Victoria tended to Patrick. The domestic scene struck him as both foreign and deeply right, as if he'd been waiting his whole life to return to this place he'd never been before. After Patrick was settled, Victoria made a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They talked late into the evening, sharing stories of their lives before that fateful night. Victoria spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her brief courtship with Samuel, and her adjustment to life in the Montana Territory. Jake told her about his years on the move, the sights he'd seen, and his growing desire for something more permanent. I won't pretend it would be easy, he said as the hour grew late. Ranch life is hard, especially for women, but you wouldn't be alone. Margaret would welcome another woman nearby, and the ranch hands respect James. They'd respect his brother's wife, too. Victoria looked startled. Are you proposing marriage, Jake Calloway? Jake flushed. I'm getting ahead of myself, but yes, eventually, if that's what you wanted. I believe in doing things properly. Victoria was quiet for so long that Jake began to fear he'd overstepped. Finally, she spoke. When Samuel died, I thought my life was over. Then when Patrick came early in that terrible storm, I was certain we would both die alone in this cabin. She looked up at Jake, her eyes clear and direct. But you came, a stranger who owed me nothing, who could have passed by Mrs. Thornton's house without a second thought. She reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand over his. I don't believe in fate, Jake. But I do believe in kindness and in second chances. If your offer still stands in the morning, I'd like to see this cabin of yours. Jake turned his hand to hold hers. It'll stand as long as you need it to. The next morning, Jake helped Victoria pack her few belongings. They decided to leave Patrick's cradle and some of the heavier furniture behind, planning to send for them later if Victoria chose to stay at the Circle C. Jake purchased a small wagon from a reluctant seller, paying more than it was worth to secure it quickly. Word of their departure spread through Hecla with remarkable speed. As they prepared to leave, several women from the church appeared with food for their journey and small gifts for Patrick, even Mrs. Thornton came, bringing a jar of her prized blackberry preserves and offering stiff apologies for her behavior during the storm. I judged too harshly, she said, not quite meeting Victoria's eyes. The Lord reminds us to be charitable. Victoria accepted the gifts graciously, though Jake noticed she made no promises to return to Hecla. The journey to the Circle C took 3 days, with frequent stops for Patrick's needs. They traveled slowly, the wagon not built for speed. Jake rode alongside, keeping watch over Victoria and the baby. At night they camped under the stars, Jake maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring their safety. On the 3rd day, as they approached the ranch, Victoria grew quiet, her apprehension visible, having second thoughts. Jake asked gently. Victoria shook her head. Just nervous. What if your family doesn't approve? Margaret's already cleared a room for you and Patrick, Jake assured her. And James trusts my judgment. They'll welcome you. The Circle C came into view as they crested a hill, a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and a large barn, all nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising in the distance. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and several horses grazed in a fenced pasture near the house. As they approached, Margaret appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, 2 Two girls with braided hair peered curiously at the wagon. James emerged from the barn, raising a hand in greeting. Jake helped Victoria down from the wagon, then carefully lifted Patrick's basket. They walked together toward the house, where Margaret was already coming to meet them. "You must be Victoria," she said warmly, taking Victoria's hands in hers. "Jake's letter said you might be joining us. I'm so glad you've come." Victoria's tension visibly eased at Margaret's welcome. "Thank you for having us. I hope we won't be an imposition." "Nonsense," Margaret declared, peering into Patrick's basket with delight. "Oh, look at him. Girls, come meet Mrs. Garland and baby Patrick." The two girls, aged 7 and 5, approached shyly. The older one, Emily, asked if she could hold the baby, while the younger, Sarah, wanted to know if Victoria liked dolls. James joined them, greeting Victoria with a tip of his hat. "Welcome to Circle C, Mrs. Garland. Any friend of Jake's is welcome here." "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Please call me Victoria." "Then you must call me James. We're informal here, unlike my brother, who suddenly developed fancy Eastern manners." Jake felt his face grow warm at his brother's teasing. "I was just being respectful." "Indeed," James said with a knowing smile. "Now, why don't you show Victoria that cabin you've been talking about non-stop while Margaret gets them settled in the house?" The next few weeks established a new rhythm. Victoria and Patrick stayed in the main house while Jake divided his time between ranch work and renovating the line cabin a mile north of the main house. The cabin, originally built as shelter for hands working the northern pastures, had solid bones but needed considerable improvement to be suitable for a family. Jake added a second room, replaced the roof, installed proper windows, and built a stone fireplace. James's hands helped when they could be spared, and Victoria often brought lunch to the site, offering suggestions that Jake incorporated into his plans. Patrick thrived in the ranch environment, growing plumper and more alert each day. Victoria seemed to blossom as well, regaining color in her cheeks and confidence in her manner. She helped Margaret with household tasks and the vegetable garden, quickly becoming an indispensable part of ranch life. Jake and Victoria's relationship developed slowly, built on shared meals, quiet conversations, and the gradual discovery of common ground. Jake found himself looking forward to evenings when, after Patrick was asleep, Victoria would join him on the porch to watch the sunset. On one such evening, about 6 weeks after their arrival, Jake finally found the courage to broach the subject they'd been circling. "The cabin will be ready next week," he said, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "It's not fancy, but it's sturdy and should be comfortable enough." Victoria nodded. "It's lovely, Jake. You've done wonderful work." "I was thinking," Jake continued, his heart racing, "that it might be time to speak to Pastor Evans in town, if you're amenable." Victoria turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Calloway?" "Yes," Jake said simply. "I am." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "I need to ask you something first. Anything?" "Why me? You could have continued on your way that night. You could have left after Patrick was born. You could have stayed here at the Circle C and found any number of suitable women. Why come back for me?" Jake considered her question carefully. "I've spent most of my life moving on when things got complicated. That night in Hecla, watching you fight to bring Patrick into the world, seeing your strength and your grace under the worst circumstances, it woke something in me. Made me realize I'd been running from the very things that might give my life meaning." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I don't believe love always comes like lightning. Sometimes it grows quietly, taking root when you're not looking. That's what happened to me. By the time I received your letter, I knew I couldn't let you go without at least trying to build something together." Victoria's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I was so afraid to trust again after Samuel died, afraid to depend on anyone. But you never asked me to be dependent, only to consider a partnership." "That's all I want," Jake assured her. "A true partnership. Patrick will need a father, and I'd be honored to fill that role, but I don't expect to replace Samuel in your heart." Victoria squeezed his hand. "Samuel will always be part of me. He gave me Patrick, but my heart has room for a new love, one that's different but no less real." She leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to Jake's cheek. Yes, Jake Calloway, I'll marry you. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Helena. Margaret had altered one of her better dresses for Victoria, adding lace at the collar and cuffs. Jake wore his only suit, purchased years before and now slightly tight across the shoulders. Patrick, nearly 3 months old, was passed between Margaret and Emily during the ceremony, remarkably quiet as if sensing the importance of the occasion. After the wedding, they moved into the cabin Jake had prepared. It was simple but comfortable, with a large main room containing the kitchen and living area, a bedroom for them, and a small room for Patrick that would eventually accommodate more children should they be so blessed. Life settled into a pleasant routine. Jake worked the ranch with James, increasingly taking on management responsibilities. Victoria tended their home, cared for Patrick, and established a productive garden. She also began making cheese and butter to sell in Helena, developing a reputation for quality that brought steady income. Their first year together brought challenges. A harsh winter tested the cabin's improvements, though Jake's careful work ensured they remained warm and dry. Spring brought flooding that nearly washed out the bridge connecting their property to the main ranch. Summer saw a drought that required constant vigilance to protect the herd. Through it all, Jake and Victoria's partnership deepened. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, when to offer help and when to step back. Patrick grew into a sturdy toddler. His first steps taken in the yard Jake had fenced for him. His first words a mix of mama and papa that brought tears to Jake's eyes. On the anniversary of their wedding, Jake surprised Victoria with a rocking chair he'd commissioned from a craftsman in Helena. That evening, as she sat rocking Patrick to sleep, Victoria shared her own surprise. "I think Patrick may need to give up his room sooner than we expected," she said softly. Jake looked up from the leather he was working. "What do you mean?" Victoria smiled, her hand resting on her stomach. "I'm fairly certain we'll be welcoming another little Calloway before winter." Jake's face transformed with joy. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside the rocker to place his hand next to hers. "When?" Dr. Miller says likely late November. "I've suspected for a while but wanted to be sure before I told you." Jake pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of the sleeping Patrick. "I never imagined I could be this happy," he whispered against her hair. "Nor I," Victoria replied. "It's strange to think how close we came to never meeting. If I hadn't gone into labor early, if you hadn't been passing through Hecla that night. If Mrs. Thornton hadn't been so disagreeable," Jake added with a small smile. Victoria laughed softly. "I should send her a thank you note." Their daughter, Emma Rose, was born on a clear November evening, delivered by the proper midwife from Helena, whom Jake had insisted on bringing to the cabin 2 weeks before Victoria's due date. Unlike her brother's dramatic arrival, Emma's birth was straightforward, attended by both Jake and Margaret, while James kept Patrick entertained at the main house. As Jake held his newborn daughter, he marveled at how completely his life had changed in less than 2 years. From a solitary drifter to a husband, father of 2, and established rancher, none of it would have happened if not for a snowstorm and a callous midwife. Victoria watched him from the bed, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. "She has your eyes," she observed. Jake brought Emma to her mother, settling beside them on the bed. "And your determination. Did you see how she came out fists first, ready to take on the world?" Victoria laughed, then winced slightly. "She'll need that spirit growing up here. She'll have everything she needs," Jake promised. "Both our children will." 5 years passed, bringing prosperity to the Circle C and 2 more children to Jake and Victoria's growing family. After Emma came Thomas James, born on the hottest day of summer, and then Lily Mee, whose winter arrival reminded them all of Patrick's birth. The cabin expanded with their family, with Jake adding rooms as needed and eventually building a proper house nearby when the cabin could stretch no further. Victoria's cheese business flourished, her products now sold in stores as far away as Butte and Bozeman. Jake and James formally partnered on the ranch, dividing responsibilities according to their strengths and gradually increasing their holdings. Patrick, now 6 years old, was the spitting image of his birth father, but had Jake's quiet manner and thoughtfulness. He adored his younger siblings and showed a natural affinity for horses that Jake encouraged. Though he knew the story of his birth to Patrick, Jake was simply Pa, the only father he'd ever known. On a warm spring evening, as the children played in the yard under Margaret's watchful eye, Jake and Victoria took a rare moment alone, riding to the ridge overlooking their property. The land was greening with new growth, cattle grazing contentedly in the distance, the house and outbuildings neat and well-maintained below them. "Did you ever imagine this?" Victoria asked, gesturing at the scene before them. "When you were riding through Hecla that night," Jake shook his head. "I didn't dare imagine anything like this. I was just trying to get through the storm." Victoria reached across to take his hand. "I thank God every day for that storm and for the midwife who turned me away." "As do I," Jake agreed, bringing her hand to his lips, "though I still glare at Mrs. Thornton when we see her in town." Victoria laughed. "She sent a christening gown for Lily, you know. I think she's still trying to make amends." "She should," Jake said firmly, "though I suppose we owe her a debt of gratitude in a strange way." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. After a while, Victoria spoke again, her voice reflective. "When Samuel died, I thought my heart would never heal. I couldn't imagine loving anyone else." She turned to Jake, her eyes soft with emotion. "But love finds us in the most unexpected ways, doesn't it? In blizzards and baby deliveries and strangers who stay until dawn." Jake smiled, remembering that night that had changed both their lives, "and sometimes stays far beyond dawn." "Forever," Victoria agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, casting their shared life in a warm, promising light.